Uh, Today we begin with the story of the largest monastery that history ever saw. And it was started in Cluny. I'll go through some of this. I had a chance a few years ago to visit it. It's one of the places I really wanted to go. A priest friend of mine and I went to France for a little over a month. And so he asked me the two places I would like to see, and I said Cluny and Mount Saint Michel. And there were two places he wanted to visit, so we went to them. But anyway, the Cluny Monastery had thousands of monks at one point, and their church, the monastery church, was the largest worship place in Christendom until St. Peter's was built in Rome. When you visit it, you're like in this little town of Cluny, and the whole thing is inside the monastery. It is the ruins of the monastery. Now, the monastery was completely destroyed during the French Revolution, but like there were pieces of it left. The hotel we stayed in, there were several walls of the hotel that were actually part of the monastery that was still standing. And I think 2 rooms were as well. But it was just a massive place. But when you study about the destruction of the church in France at that time, one of the things that happened over a period of time is that the abbots in monasteries, rather than living in the regular quarters of the monks that were basically dormitories, the abbot would have a private cell. And then that private cell evolved into a building, a home, that was on the grounds of the monastery. And the person who was appointed the abbot of a monastery was appointed by the king. So the king would appoint this particular person as an abbot, and then they would be consecrated in the ceremony and everything. But once a monastery became very wealthy, then people really wanted to be an abbot there, because to have access to that kind of money. And you watch the abbot's dwellings get larger on the grounds. And if you visit Paris today, one of the buildings you can visit is called the Clooney House. And it's a very large home. It's a small palace. It's actually where the abbot of Cluny lived. He lived in Paris in that house. And as the king would appoint these people, the king's interest, of course, was in people who would help him and stuff. So when we imagine the size of Cluny, I think at its largest, there were probably 30,000 monks living there. But at the time the French Revolution was destroyed, I think there were 15 monks living there, and the abbot was Cardinal Richelieu, and he lived in Paris. So they had no spiritual root. And so all of these religious institutions, particularly the wealthy ones, were at risk. But Cluny is just, if you ever get a chance to go to France, try and visit the ruins of Cluny. So in the year 910, William the Pious of Aquitaine built this monastery in Cluny, France. The abbot was Bruno, and he was a man famous for the holiness of his life. Bruno had been working for a while in different kinds of things, and people knew him to be an extremely holy man. And the monastery actually grew rather fast because of the impact of this man's holiness and people wanting to be with him. But it's under his successor. His successor was named Odo. His successor, who also had a reputation for good works and amazing gift for organization. Under him, the monastery really took off. And as I mentioned, it would become the largest monastery ever to exist. And it went on for many, many years. The Pope requested that Odo teach the Cluniac system and spirituality to all the monasteries in Rome. And over a period of time, Odo came to govern many monasteries all around the area who would bring their communities under the rule of Cluny. Now remember, the rule of Cluny is not the Benedictine rule, okay? It was a separate rule. In 954, when he died, everything was so well established and so perfectly organized that it would continue on just on that track for a very long time. The chief activity of the Cluniac monks was the celebration of the sacred liturgy. They had very elaborate and very solemn services. Most of the monks' time was actually spent in prayer. Cluny was under the direct authority of the Pope. The local bishop had no authority over Cluny, and it gradually became a place, a center for church reform. And so it would be independent of the politics of the country and independence of the politics of the church in that area. And it became a center of church reform. Many of the monks were consecrated bishops by the Pope himself. He would pick out different monks, consecrate them bishops, and send them to dioceses. And these men who came out of Cluny and became bishops in these different dioceses would bring about reform in the diocese to which they went. And these are known in history as the Cluniac Reforms. There have been several of them. But a different pope would come in, and every bishop he appointed, he would take out of the monks of Cluny and put in as spiritual leaders in order to reform the church. It was a powerful thing. I think if you list all the abbots of Cluny from the beginning to the end, almost half of them are canonized saints. And you'll see them one after another saints. Just very, very holy and active people. Because they had been consecrated by the Pope and became bishops, they also became the advisors to kings. And several times in the church, they brought about these Cluniac reforms all over Western Europe. These periods of reform were so many that many of the abbots of Cluny that were canonized, I think there were more saints among their abbots than there were uncanonized. I would say maybe over a period of time, actually, more saints than uncanonized. And that's sort of the history of Cluny, but it's a massive monastery, and it's difficult to overestimate the influence that Cluny had upon the church itself. But it really tells you what can happen in a place like that when you really have an abbot who is committed to holiness rather than to running an organization or something. In the year 972, there was a young man named Romuald who wanted to atone for a murder that had been committed by his father. He was a very devotional man. His father had been guilty of a murder, and he decided to enter a monastery and become a monk, in this way to somehow atone for the murder. However, he found the life that was going on in the monastery not to his liking. He said it was too soft. He decided he wanted more discipline and a more solitary life. When you go into monasteries, you find that monasteries are very different inside. There are monasteries like where you never hear people talk to one another at all. Trappist monasteries are famous for that. And they would find ways even of using hand language rather than speak if they could avoid. You weren't supposed to hear a human voice. And oftentimes these monasteries were involved in farming and stuff like that, and they would have these monks working these vast areas. And over a period of time, serfs took over from the monks, but the lands belonged to the monastery. But you can go into another monastery where their principal role is teaching. Let's say these monks are working in a school, maybe a school connected with a monastery. They're working in the school, and obviously that requires their speaking, and they're studying together. Several monks will be in the library speaking because they're studying together. And the idea of silence just isn't a part of that monastery. Sometimes there's a lot of time spent with the monks together. Sometimes it's very minimal. It just depends, but it's very different in different monasteries. And that's obviously what the different communities come from. So after 10 years in Spain, he returned to Italy, and so many people were attracted to the life he was living. He was living a life, now remember, that is more solitary and more disciplined than they were finding in the monasteries at the time. And so as he traveled around the country, he would reform monasteries and sometimes found monasteries. Like he would go into an area and they would ask him to come in and reform the monastery. He would, and you'd have people come in and join. He'd go to another area where he could not persuade the monastery to reform, but a lot of people wanted to follow his life, so he would found a new monastery. And he did this all over the country. He founded the community that's known as the Delese monks, and they're named for the mountain. Their first monastery was built on Mount Delese, and so that's where they are named for. The Delese monks are in this diocese in Big Sur. They have two major monasteries. One is Big Sur, and one is in Delese itself. The thing that they do, the Delese monks, as far as lifestyle, is each monk has his own private living quarters connected to a patio area with a garden. And so the monks do farming and raise most of their own food. But that raising of most of their own food is done individually. They don't work together on a farm. And then the food is collected, like let's say you're raising carrots. So the food is collected by one of the brothers from the monks as to what they harvest out of their garden that day. And he will prepare a soup or something like that out of this, and that will be their food. And that's largely the way they live. Since Vatican II, they've been encouraged to spend more time together. So I think they have meals together on occasion, but they certainly come together for liturgy. It used to be each one said Mass alone in their individual cells, but now they come together for a celebrated Mass once a day. They say office and things together. But they are probably the community in the entire church where solitude has the highest value. Now, Romuald was followed by another man who became a saint. Romuald was a saint, and so was the man who followed him. The man who followed him was Peter Damian, and he stabilized the foundation and got it on a very, very sound financial basis. One of the things, I don't know I've mentioned this before as we're going through church history, when you study different religious communities, the most important person in a religious community is the second person. The first person is charismatic and I guess I would say obsessive with their view. And so like you would come in with someone like a Francis of Assisi, who wants to own nothing, will have nothing, won't settle down anywhere. He just wants to be basically a nomad. And when he dies, the man who follows him gets it all organized and set up. And the same thing happened. We talked about Odo at the Cluny. Well, here it was Peter Damian. And Peter Damian is the one that organized the communities and got them all set up. You look at a community today like Mother Teresa's sisters. Mother Teresa was the typical personality to found a religious order. She was absolutely magnetic. Anytime she went and spent any time, people there wanted to join her. And so there are houses and everything all over. The question is, with the person who followed her, how well does that person organize the order? And do you watch the order just slowly disappear after, or does the order grow? It has to do with that second person, okay? The year 1000, in Western Europe now, education and study became the primary work of the monks. Now understand that before this, the primary work of the monks was in fact farming. And in many of the monastic orders originally, they were forbidden to take donations. Like once their monastery was founded, they were expected to support themselves and give a tithe off the food and everything they raised to the poor in the area. But over a period of time, they came to be supported much like we see them today in donations and stuff like that. But the transition was the monks began primarily to teach. Now, schools at this time were generally connected either to a cathedral, we've talked a couple times before, like under Charlemagne, about the cathedral schools. So they would be connected to a cathedral, or they would in fact be attached to a monastery. And the other thing about them is education was primarily for monks and priests. Those were the students. The important thing that took place at this time is a Swiss monastery called St. Gall. There they began for the first time to teach a small number of lay students. So they allowed people who come in as students who have no intention of being a monk or a priest. Now understand, there would be a lot of people who would be educated toward being a priest or toward being a monk and decide not to do that, so eventually could leave with an education. But they did not ordinarily educate lay people. In the case of a wealthy person, like a king or a prince or something, you would probably have a tutor to educate your children. But in general, you didn't have the education. So there were many, many famous teachers at the school. Probably the most famous of them was called Labeo. He was the very first person to write in spoken German rather than in Latin. Remember, the schools were all conducted in Latin. This was seen, the language of educated people was Latin, and it was a universal language. It's interesting today that today the universal language is English. And when you go to educated people in almost any country, they have, to the degree of the country, a smattering of English. Everyone sort of gets some English. I think one of the things that most amazes me is that when you watch the impact of English on other languages, and particularly in the age of technology, most other languages, even if you were to speak Spanish or to speak French, you would find a lot of English words in the language itself that have just worked in. Incidentally, that's rarer in French than any other. There is an institute in France for the purity of the language, and they will stop books and everything that allow the language to be corrupted by other languages, okay? So the students began their education with what was called the trivium. The trivium is 3 subjects. It's first of all grammar, and we know basically what grammar is. The second is dialectics, and dialectics is probably what you and I would call logic. And they learned how to reason correctly and learn things. I remember when we started logic, logic is one of probably the most influential courses I ever took. And you learn to think in a very different way. What you study in logic are syllogisms. And syllogisms, you state a fact, you state a second fact, and you draw the third fact. And when you put these together, you have to analyze to see whether they are correct, okay? And I'll give you an example. All barns are red. This building is red. This building is a barn. That's wrong. And that's because it doesn't say all red buildings are barns. It says all barns are red. So if you were to say all barns are red, this is a barn, then you could say this is red. But once you learn how logic works, it's very interesting to listen to advertisements on TV. It's devastating to listen to political speeches. So the last thing they learned was rhetoric, which was public speaking, and we would call that rhetoric today. But included in them, for them, in rhetoric, was writing properly. And now you remember, at this time, rock stars are people who can hold an audience. This is what makes a rock star at this time in history. These people become great, whether they're in religion or politics or anything. It's the ability to grab a crowd. Even in our own day, people who are very, very good at holding the attention of a crowd are very, very powerful people. I think you know that's probably the single talent that Adolf Hitler had, was his ability to mesmerize people with his speaking. Once they finished these three topics, then they moved on to what was called the quadrivium. And it was arithmetic, as we know it. It was geometry, it was music, and it was astronomy. Astronomy was a science that was just really beginning to go at this time. So these things were put together. Together, these would one day become known in our own day. This is what's called liberal arts. And the name is chosen because these studies were supposed to liberate the mind, okay? And if you look at these studies, it's very interesting. Like when you look at arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, if you've ever worked much in each one of them, you know that they're all mathematics, that they all have to do with mathematics, how planets move and everything. That is all mathematics. And the earlier ones, what we call grammar, dialectics, and rhetoric, they all have to do with communication. So math and communication were the head of this education. And this liberated the mind to be able to think and this sort of thing and view the world very differently. Students could actually go on to other studies, but actually only monks and priests were allowed to study theology. I have no idea why that restriction existed, but if you were not a priest and were not a monk, there was no chance that you could study theology. This was also the beginning of the great push to create the huge cathedrals that we see in Europe today. They have I don't know if you've ever heard this, they have a standard joke about tours of Europe. They're called ABC tours, another bloody cathedral. And you go from cathedral to cathedral in many of these places. There were already cathedrals in all the important cities in Europe. But at this point, towns began to compete with one another as to who had the largest and the most beautiful cathedral. And there are instances, I forget, it's one of the cities in Italy. One of the cities in Italy is a massive cathedral you visit, and while you're visiting it, you notice a huge wall that goes off to the side, and you discover that what is the huge cathedral you're visiting was to be the arm of the cathedral. The cathedral was to be in cross form. There would be a long part, then one arm, a top, and the other arm. And the fact is, they made it so large they could not put a roof over it. They hadn't perfected it enough for the roof to go over it. And so that's the way it sat. As a result of this, people began to experiment. And they had to experiment with construction and decoration. And just one thing on this, I had a cousin of mine who became an architect, I think in UC San Diego. And in his thesis for his doctorate, what he covered was architectural firsts in St. Peter's Basilica. Like when I think you know it's a massive church. And when they started putting it up, there's certain things, like the first time they put the dome of St. Peter's, and the reason, this shows you the competition thing. If you've ever been to Rome, one of the large churches in Rome is called the Pantheon, and it's regarded as one of the most perfect buildings ever built. It's a beautiful building, and it was built to all the gods. It had a huge dome on it. And Michelangelo, when people would talk about great buildings, it drove him crazy. They always talked about the Pantheon. So he said, when I build my building, I'll put the Pantheon on top of it. And so he did. The dome of St. Peter's and everything is the measurement of this Pantheon dome. However, in the Pantheon, that rises from the ground. In St. Peter's, that rises up in the middle of a church. And when they built it, it collapsed into the church. And so they had to clean it all up and figure what they would do. What they did, they invented reinforced concrete. What they did was made a concrete ring, and they put a chain in it while it was wet. And so it reinforced the concrete, and then they went on in building. But amazing, advances were made here. This is one of the things you'll notice with regards to Frank Lloyd Wright. If you study Frank Lloyd Wright If you wanted a house, he really dominated what he wanted and everything in the house. But he would find out kind of from what you wanted. Like if you were a movie producer, you might want a movie theater in your house. But part of the great innovation of Frank Lloyd Wright was that he would take the design that you had, and then he would make sure it could go in a house and fit in a house, all this sort of thing. And he invented and developed all kinds of things because of his commitment to do this. He did not go about a building as to what I can build. He goes about a building as to what do I want to see, okay? And I noticed when I think many of you know I did silkscreen for many years, that you'd get a design in your mind and you'd really want to do it, but it was something that simply could not be silkscreened. And so you'd wait until silkscreen advanced or show someone what you wanted to do. We had a man in San Luis who would look at my designs and would play with his machinery until he found out a way actually to print it. And he became a teacher all over the world in how silkscreen worked. So anyway, the first style that came into existence at this time combined classical Greece, it combined Rome, and it combined Byzantium. Byzantium had the highly decorated gold churches and all this sort of thing. And finally, if you've ever been to the Arab world, there's a set feeling about big buildings in the Arab world, and they have vast open spaces. And so they wanted that as part of this as well. And the architecture they created is called Romanesque. In the United States, perhaps the very best example of a Romanesque church is the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. It's not an old church, but it was built as an example of this kind of architecture, largely to show the age of the Catholic Church itself in D.C. This style produced massive churches with very thick walls, but the other thing that was missing here is windows. They had very few windows. Glass windows will not come into existence until about 1300. So they had these huge windows. Glass windows in a house, if you notice ancient buildings with glass windows, what they would do was blow glass in a circle. They would, on a piece of stone, they would blow the glass as it was done, and then they would break it off on the edges and put it in a window. So if you go to very old windows, they're very thick in the center and go out like this in a circle, and because that's how they made it. But you couldn't make big windows for buildings that way, so they didn't have glass in these big areas. The altar area was elevated above the congregation so that in a very large place the people could see it. Initially they had small congregations and people gathered around the altar, much as we're trying to do today. Because of the shortage of Catholic clergy, many dioceses, and I think this is one, I don't think you can build a church for under 1,000 people today. And it's because of the way they gathered. But when I came to the Diocese of Monterey, the churches they built were about 400. And they built them all over, and you had lots of priests, and people gathered. 400 is still a large group. But in the early church, I would say probably 20 to 50 people constituted a congregation. And so they would gather around. Once you begin to get these big churches, then you have to elevate the altar, okay? I'd also remind you that there's something in the human psyche that connects height with religion. And so like if you go down to Mexico, if you're on a plain where there's no mountains or anything, they build a pyramid and put the altar on top. If you have mountains, they put it on top of the mountain. All kinds of ways of doing this, but somehow higher is closer to God, so they constantly do that. So this area where the altar was came to be called the presbytery. Now the presbytery means a very different thing in church today, but the presbytery, the translation of the word would be priest's place. And the presbytery at that time was known as the altar area. And again, if I were to go back to when I was ordained, the altar area was not only raised high, but it was separated by a fence called the altar rail. And so it was separate, and there were very strict rules about who could go in the altar rail. No layperson could really go in the altar rail other than someone to serve the priest's mass. And so you weren't allowed to have people in doing like readings and stuff like that. That didn't take place then. Often there was a burial site located below the presbytery. And an example of a burial site located below the presbytery is the cathedral in Los Angeles. You visit the cathedral in Los Angeles, go downstairs. Underneath is basically a mausoleum, and where they hope to have the bishops to be buried. Normally bishops, in a cathedral, normally bishops were buried in the presbytery. Behind the altar, there were often shrines to various saints, and their relics were there, okay? And the thing is, they used kind of a cruciform, and the altar was in the center there, but there was nothing behind the priest. There would be a wall or something there, but you could go back into that area, and they had small altars. At that time, priests never concelebrated a mass together. So if you had 20 priests in a parish, each of the priests would say their own mass. And I'll give you an example. Like a lot of times, people do not realize the amount of change that's taken place in the church simply in my lifetime. When I entered the seminary, we had about 15 priests who were on the seminary faculty. And when we went in to celebrate the seminary mass in the morning, one of them would celebrate the mass for the priests, and there were 20 side altars in little chapels right off to the side. You could see all of them. And all the other professors would be in celebrating mass alone in these individual things. By the time I graduated from the seminary, all the priests would celebrate together on the main altar. But at this time, they had these little altars. Altars were to favored saints. Different people would donate the altars to their saint. And oftentimes, a relic of the saint would be enshrined there. In fact, if they were to acquire a relic, they would normally build a shrine. That would be the what do you want to call it, the instigation of the building of the chapel. There were also the relics of a martyr placed inside the altar to remember the Catacombs of Rome. If you remember at the beginning, we talked that in Rome, in order to hide during the persecutions, they would celebrate Mass in the catacombs. And the catacombs were large tunnels underneath the city with bodies buried in niches as you up the side. And when it reached a certain height, then they dug it probably 8 feet deep again and started putting more bodies. So it's very, very thick. There are places where the tunnels intersect. Sometimes they'll intersect 4 of them, 5 of them will intersect at the same place. The services that they had in the catacombs were normally held where the tunnels intersected. And that way, if someone coming down a tunnel accidentally found you, you could disperse through many tunnels and they couldn't catch you. So they set it up that way. What they would normally do would be celebrate Mass on the grave of one of the people who had given their life for the faith. Now remember, at this time they weren't canonizing saints and stuff like that, but they knew anyone who had died for the faith, was with God. So they would celebrate the Mass on that. Once they began to build churches upstairs, and the Roman Constantine allows freedom of the church, they then always put the relics of a martyr in the altar itself. And that was continued with these very, very big altars, okay? The inside of the church was normally filled with paintings and carvings, all dealing with biblical subjects. So that while it was a massive building, it was highly decorated on the inside, but paintings, mosaics, and that sort of stuff. And these actually were used as teaching aids. And they were used as teaching aids because congregations were largely illiterate. And I may have mentioned this before, it's one of my favorite facts. But because of this, art highly influences Roman Catholic theology. And probably the best example has to do with the conversion of St. Paul. There's a painting by an artist called Titian in which the conversion of St. Paul, Paul is fallen off a horse. He has a foot in a stirrup, and there's a shaft of light coming down at him, and he's going back like this. And when you talk to Catholics about the conversion of St. Paul, they will almost inevitably talk about him being thrown off his horse. In the Bible, all it says was that he was knocked down. Now, he could have been riding a horse or something, but it just says he was knocked down. But this particular painting has been I guess, the design focus for thousands of stained glass windows. I've seen it in hundreds of churches. And so people acquaint that it affects the story. The illustrations had a very high effect on this. Now, the interesting thing about these great cathedrals is they were the work of very many people. And if you go into some of the more elaborate older cathedrals, you can actually watch style changes as it goes through in the cathedral. And you can watch different styles of art develop and that sort of thing. And this took place often over a period of many years. At St. Peter's Basilica, I think one of the early people to work on it was a man called Bernini, who's one of the most famous silver and gold workers in the history of Italy. And he's responsible certainly for the colonnade in front. And Michelangelo, I think you know, is responsible for the dome and some of the design of the building, but someone else was responsible for the basic design. The thing is, so many people contributed, and it took so long that these buildings were not completed in a lifetime. Many of them were completed in hundreds of years. In fact, the big cathedral that has been designed in Barcelona, a specific artist did the whole design, and they're actually following his designs. So it'll be like it was done by one artist. But I think the completion date would allow 200 years for the thing to be built. And it's, it goes on that way. And interesting, this would go on through wars, plagues, famines, that sort of thing. This is also the period of very extensive missionary activity. Adalbert was the son of a duke in Prague, and while he was a student in Germany, he became a Catholic and decided to spend the rest of his life working for the conversion of his own people in Prague. So he went back to the area around Prague and began the process of training the people. He returned to Rome and became a priest, and then went back to Prague as bishop. When the people there forced him to leave the city, they didn't really want him around, he went back to Rome, and 3 days later returned again to Prague and began a series of teaching missions to the whole area of Bohemia. Prague was part at that time of Bohemia. And so he began teaching. He was a powerful teacher. People really listened to him. But when he started founding the church, he alienated the people of Prague. So what he started doing was he would travel around and preach to people. And now he's a bishop, so he could ordain a priest to stay with them as he moved on. And if you remember, that's exactly the way Paul did. Paul was an excellent preacher. He'd gather people around. Paul had great trouble getting along with anyone. So once he had the whole thing set up, he appointed leaders in the time, and he moved on to another place. And Paul's missionary journeys were extremely successful that way. And so he would spend the rest of his life doing that. He began a series of missions to Poland and to Hungary, and then on to the Prussian tribes. Adalbert seriously encouraged people who had accepted the faith to become very active in spreading the gospel. Now, when we talk about him being in Hungary and in Poland, we're talking about him engaging royalty. One of the things initially in the Jesuits is the Jesuits initially opened very good schools for high people in government so that they could greatly influence the governing and everything of countries. It became a very important thing in the Jesuits. Remember, the Jesuits are founded largely in response to the Reformation. And so the big problem with the Reformation was Catholic clergy was so poorly educated. So the Jesuits set up these schools both to help in the education of clergy, but mainly to educate government so they would understand what the church is and not see it as an enemy. And Adalbert did the same thing. He concentrated on people in government, and he sought not to make converts, but more to make missionaries. Many of the leaders he did convert eventually saw the Catholic faith as a way of uniting their country. We tend to think of terms of countries now, but at this point there were very few cities, no villages, that sort of thing. Most people were involved in agriculture, and you would have tribes, like for instance, if we were to take, it would be very much like the North America when Columbus arrived, where there were individual tribes, and to say they had a set area was not really true. Like the community I'm from, the Assiniboine, we're known as Plains natives. So the Assiniboine are the northern half of the Sioux, and they move all over the plains of Canada, Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, Alberta. They were in the plains. They lived in the plains. They didn't go into forests. They didn't go into mountains. They lived in the plains. The Sioux and the Apache and stuff like that did that down in the States. They lived in the plains, but they could be moving different areas around. They didn't have borders, and that was going on at this time. But as these people became educated in the faith, they began to see that teaching the faith would be a way of drawing their people into something that was common. Now, they had their tribe as common, but they wanted them to have their faith as common, that would draw them together from the different tribes. And again, you'll notice in the founding of the United States, one of the big things that went on was the people who founded the United States were not really members of any religion, but were deists. And as a result of that, that in the United States, we feel united largely by a belief in God. Not that I'm a Catholic, or you're a Baptist, or you're a Mormon, or you're a Muslim, but we're united more by our belief in God than we are by the specific religion we belong to. And that becomes a unifying point. As you know today, with the knowledge and belief in God and religion waning, that's no longer holding us together very well. And I think most people would admit that we aren't actually being held together very well at all today anyway. So Adalbert was extremely effective. And finally, in 997, Adalbert was actually beheaded. He was killed by a group of pagan tribesmen. In the year 966, Duke Mieszko formed a strong force of knights and conquered the warring tribes that lived in what we today know as Poland. Again, there were all these tribes, so he conquered them all, actually. He married a Catholic woman who came from Bohemia, that's around Prague, and was himself baptized. And then he began the process to work for the conversion of Poland. He was probably one of the most effective rulers to ever do this in history. And by the time of his death, you could have defined Poland as a Catholic country. He reaped huge advantages by uniting his country in the religion. And he also took Poland and linked it very closely with Western Europe. You see, Poland can be very Eastern, but he linked them both in culture and everything to Western Europe. In 990, symbolically, he gave Poland as a gift to the Pope. Now, he was working on something very specific here. He wanted to take it away from the influence of the German bishops who had helped to supply clergy to Poland. So Adalbert, when he came in and was working for these conversions, Adalbert brought the clergy to help him. A lot of them he brought out of Germany. Germany had a very powerful church at this time. But when the German clergy came in, they were very influenced by the German church. Now remember that there wasn't a whole lot of unity in the way things were conducted. They were united under the Pope, but the way things went on were very specific in different areas. And so he wanted the church to be Polish, not to be German. And I think you know that that's one of the things when we look back on the missions in California. One of the problems is that the people who came here as missionaries wanted the natives to be as Spanish as they were Catholic. And so the imposition of the culture is the thing that was so painful in this area. So anyway, Germany finally recognized Poland as an independent country and totally separate from German rule. In 896, there was the Mogtars. They were a nomadic people, and oftentimes nomads would travel around and at a certain point decide to settle in an area. And they began to settle in Hungary. Their clans, however, were constantly at war with one another. They had a bunch of clans in this community. They would evolve in and they would settle. Another group would evolve in and they would settle. They all had the same ethnic background, but they weren't have any kind of unity. They were united by a man called Geza, and his son converted. And when he converted to Catholicism, he invited German missionaries into Hungary. So again, now we see the German missionaries, and this time they move into Hungary. As king, he built churches, and he's the first one to formally establish Sunday as the day of worship for the entire country. So it became the day of worship was Sunday. And he also began celebrating the Roman feasts. One of the interesting things when we celebrate Mass as a priest, Masses have different themes, but a remarkable number of our Masses, the themes are Roman saints, Saint Sebastian, Saint Lucy, all these people. The great number of them are the early Roman martyrs, because when the liturgies were established according to theme, that was very close to that period. He still, just like Poland, managed to keep the Hungarian church independent of the German church. So they wanted the faith to come in, but they wanted the faith to unite Hungary, not to unite it to Germany, and to unite Poland, but not to unite it to Germany. Stephen, their king, was supported by Pope Sylvester II and the emperor in Germany, Otto III. And in the year 1000, Pope Sylvester crowned Stephen king. According to legend, the crown that was made for St. Stephen was a gift from the Pope and is supposed to have included one of the nails that was used on the cross of Jesus, that was a relic, that was melted down into the crown itself. One of the really interesting things about the crown is the cross on top is bent. And it's been bent for so long in paintings, it always appears bent. It's called the Crown of St. Stephen. It was at the year 1000. During the Second World War, it disappeared. And at the end of the war, it was still gone. Finally, when Hungary achieved its own independence from the Soviet Union, the crown was gifted back to Hungary by the American government, that they had taken it so that it would not fall into Russian hands. The Hungarians adopted the Roman alphabet and the customs of Western Europe. Okay? So you notice again, we're drawing these people not into the individual countries like Germany, but we're drawing them into a sense of Europe. Now, in the 10th century, the Vikings, and remember when we say Normans, the Normans and the Vikings are the same people. Okay, so the Normans took part of France and settled there. And when they began to settle there, they were very successful in taking over. They severed their ties with Scandinavia. They became a strong military force. The Normans became a very strong military force, will eventually conquer England. But they severed their thing with Scandinavia. They no longer were people of the sea like the Vikings. They no longer went along and raided areas. They established a territory and began to build. They became Christian and adopted the French way of life. Their conversion was kind of slow, and there was no one who specifically went in and converted them. But they it's as though they had been converted by France. When they went into France, the French people that everything they were dealing with, they picked up the religion. They were strongly supported by the church and made use of educated clergy in their civil structure. As they got started, they were not well-educated people. And what they did was bring in the local Catholic clergy, who were the educated people, and made them very much part of the civil government. They united the country, and they built it on a feudal model. And they built an extremely strong state. And I think maybe we'll stop it there and pick it up with the growth of the Normans next week. Thank you very much.